this is the second annual Barfield conference, and so I just wanted to mention that on behalf of Jeffrey Ippolito, president of the Owen Barfield Society, who cannot be here in the flesh. Last year we had a first annual Barfield conference about Barfield and Tolkien. So this is the second one. The theme is Plotinus and Barfield, so a challenging and bold juxtaposition. We will hear in the morning 3 papers. Before lunch, we will have a lot of time for discussion, and I have the honor to start off with a paper on parts, wholes, and persons from Plotinus to Owen Barfield. Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, in his 1968 book Introduction to Christianity, points out that St. Augustine's theology of the Trinity as subsisting relations rather than 3 beings coexisting within God testifies to the revolution in the way self has come to be understood in the Western tradition. He writes, quote, "In this idea of relatedness in word and love, independent of the concept of substance and not to be classified among the accidents, Christian thought discovered the kernel of the concept of person, which describes something other and infinitely more than the mere idea of the individual." End of quote. And you will see all the quotes on the handout. For Ratzinger, the person is radical openness and relatedness, while individuality suggests something entirely different: limitations, boundaries, and a kind of monadic substance. It seems to be the case that it was Christian Platonism which transformed the way the self was understood in the classical Greek thought. But intriguingly, this new Christian way of understanding the person can be also found in Plotinus, who wasn't a Christian. It is probable that he was influenced by this new way of understanding personality or the person in his youth in Alexandria. We have to remember that Porphyry refers to Platonizing Sethian Gnostics, whom Plotinus knew well and criticized harshly, simply as Christiano. Plotinus believes that every individual exists within the cosmic principles of intellect and soul as a part within the whole. So our soul is a part of soul hypostasis, and our intellect, the highest aspect of the soul, is a part of the cosmic intellect by virtue of what I propose to call horizontal participation in my recent book on Plotinus, which soon should be out with the Cambridge University Press. This is another way of talking about a dynamic relationship of union between the part and the whole to which it belongs. Plotinus usually uses the example of the branches of science and science as such, or of scientific propositions and science, to describe this kind of participatory identity of the part with the whole, which doesn't obliterate the difference of each part and yet enables all parts to be both the whole and each other through the whole. A more poetic and experiential, contemplative way of describing the life of the cosmic intellect being can be found in Enneads 5:8, where Plotinus writes, you can look at the handout, "For it is the easy life there, and truth is their mother and nurse and being and food, and they see all things, not those to which coming to be, but those to which real being belongs. And they see themselves in other things, for all things there are transparent, and there is nothing dark or opaque. Everything and all things are clear to the inmost part to everything, for light is transparent to light. Each there has everything in himself and sees all things in every other, so that all are everywhere, and each and every one is all, and the glory is unbounded. For each of them is great, because even the small is great. The sun there is all the stars, and each star is the sun and all the others. A different kind of being stands out in each, but in each all are manifest. End of quote. The fall of the soul through pride, which Plotinus describes as the source of human evil and sin, is the act of closing oneself and narrowing our consciousness down to being only an individual or only a part, and thus to separate oneself from the whole, from being everything. Being everything, for Plotinus, doesn't have anything to do with ontological disappearance or distraction of the individual self. Far from it. He insists that his central idea of the return and ascent to the One would be nonsense if it were to involve the annihilation of the unique self of each of us. For him, every person is a real being, and, I quote, no real being ever ceases to exist. This is from Enniad's 4.3.5. Plotinus's beautiful metaphors of the cosmic intellect being as the great city, possessing one soul, or a spherical being all faces, pamprosopon. This is Plotinus's neologism, both were later used by St. Augustine to describe his caelum caeli, the heaven of heavens, that is, the community of angels, which he also calls creatura spiritualis or creatura intellectualis in his Confessions, Book 12. The unity of intellects in intellect is based for Plotinus and Augustine on love and the shared contemplation of the good. In it, every person is every other person, and all persons are the whole, the all, without losing their individual selves. If the fall in Plotinus and Augustine means to become merely our individual self, and thus to become less than ourselves, turning into a mere shadow of the person, contemplative participation means to be truly ourselves, that is, to be infinitely more than ourselves. Joseph Ratzinger writes, Christian faith does not come from isolated individuals, but from the knowledge that there is no individual alone, that man is much more himself when he is included in the whole, in humanity, in history, in the cosmos, as befits a spirit in the flesh and what is essential to him. End of quote. The future Pope Benedict XVI emphasizes here also that what is an obstacle to this, what he calls inclusion in the whole, is what modernity calls matter, although we have to be always mindful that the meaning of the word changed almost completely in modern times. Ratzinger rejects as a dead end the traditional scholastic interpretations of the bodily resurrection, and especially the attempts to describe the properties of resurrected bodies. For him, it suggests an erroneous idea that the resurrection is a rejoining of a separate thing called the body, which has already died, decomposed, and mingled with the physical universe, with the second thing called the soul. He says, quote, St. Paul does not teach the resurrection of bodies, only of persons, and not by a return to corporeality, that is, of biological creations, which, as he makes clear, is impossible. This is, of course, a reference to first letter to Corinthians. In that he goes even further, Ratzinger goes even further than C.S. Lewis postulated in his letters to Malcolm, chiefly in prayer, his last book, that we ought to think about the resurrection of the body as the resurrection of the senses. Ratzinger thinks along the Platonic lines when he insists that the main point of the dogma of the resurrection, confessed in the Apostolic Creed, is that the resurrected body no longer performs its function of separating human persons from each other and from the whole of the universe. He writes, quote, if the cosmos constitutes history and matter a moment in the history of spirit, then there is no neutral existence of matter alongside spirit, only the ultimate complexification, the original was in German, of course, the ultimate complexification in which the world finds its final omega and its unity, end of quote. Although there is a gesture, obviously, towards the controversial theology of Teilhard de Chardin here, Ratzinger is really thinking along Plotinian lines, which were later absorbed into the philosophy of the Church Fathers. What the final complexification of the resurrected body of humanity and of the spiritualized matter will be, we have little idea. But Ratzinger's eschatology seems strikingly close to Owen Barfield's view of the evolution of consciousness, especially his remark that matter is a moment in the history of the spirit. I don't know if Pope Benedict read Barfield, although we know that he read and appreciated C.S. Lewis. In 1951, Barfield wrote an essay entitled Form in Art and in Society. It's published in The Rediscovery of Meaning, in which he discusses Vladimir Solovyov's series of essays published as The Meaning of Love in 1894, in which the Russian theosophist fully embraced the Platonic or even Plotinian view of the part and the whole. Solovyov writes about the truth as the identity of the part with the whole, by virtue of which the part is the part precisely by being the whole, and is the whole precisely by being the part. If we close ourselves in our partiality and individuality, we are beyond truth, says Solovyov, while the truth is the union of all. Solovyov describes man's fall entirely in Plotinian and Augustinian terms as, quote, not being in the truth, end of quote. And Solovyov follows, this is in the handout, but originally and immediately, the individual human being, like the animal, is not in the truth. He finds himself as an individualized infinitesimal particle of the universal whole, and this, his particular being, he affirms in his egoism as a whole for itself, wishing to be all in separation from the all outside the truth. Truth as a living power that takes possession of the eternal being of a human and actually rescues him from false self-assertion is termed love. Love, as the actual abrogation of egoism, is the real justification and salvation of individuality. End of quote. This salvation is accomplished by the love of God expressed in the incarnation, as Solovyov points out, which allows us to participate in God and by virtue of that to be everything without ceasing to be ourselves. Participating in God, who is, as Solovyov writes, all. He possesses in one absolute act all positive content, the whole fullness of being. And Solovyov adds, in the truth, the individual person is only a living and real, yet indivisible ray of one ideal light, the unity of the all essence. This ideal person or personified idea is only an individualization of the unity of the all, which is indivisibly present in each of its individualizations, end of quote. The ultimate realization of it is the resurrection of the body, and it will be made possible by the spiritualization of matter, according to Solovyov, because separation, like for Plotinus before him and for Ratzinger and Barfield after him, exists only in corporeal being and consists in what Solovyov calls impenetrability into dimensions, time and space. This means that a corporeal thing cannot retain its past and incorporate it into its present and future, but each moment destroys the previous one and establishes the temporal separateness of what the thing is now from what it was before. Spatial impenetrability, on the other hand, means that the two bodies cannot be in the same place, but one must displace or destroy the other to replace it. This is an entirely neo-Darwinian world, a world of great competition for existence, where one thing exists at the expense of another. Solovyov writes, quote, if the root of false existence consists in impenetrability, that is, in the mutual exclusion of beings by each other, then true life is to live in another as in oneself, or to find in another the positive and absolute fulfillment of one's own being, end of quote. True salvation, then, is liberation from the exclusion of beings, as he puts it. Barfield brings into his reading of Solovyov's essays Rudolf Steiner's book, The Threefold Social Order, based on his 1911-1912 lectures, emphasizing a very Christian element again, namely the social and political dignity of the person and his freedom. Barfield writes in his Form in Art and in Society, quote, the greatest possible unity of the whole should be realized in the greatest possible independence and freedom of individual and single elements, end of quote. But already earlier, in the late 1920s, Barfield wrote a treatise De Toto et Parte, on whole and part, which was addressed to Lewis and which was part of their intellectual polemic at the time, called by Lewis the Great War. As a result of it, Lewis became a theist in the spring of 1930, and a year and a half later, a Christian. In this treatise, Barfield discusses metaphysical concepts which are so clearly present in both Plotinus and Solovyov. On this occasion, Barfield also points out that he sees himself in the long tradition of Christian Platonism when he speaks about, and here I quote, Dionysius, Areopagite, and Aquinas, and Steiner, and the tradition generally. The main idea of the toto et parte is that being a part, that is, the human individual, not only does not exclude being the whole, but is the condition of being the whole. Barfield writes, I must be a part in order to be the whole, end of quote. In doing so, Barfield uses the image of mountain springs becoming rivers and falling into the sea. It's worth keeping in mind that for him, this metaphor doesn't entail any literal annihilation of the human person. Here I quote from Toto et parte. All parts are predicable of other parts, and ultimately of the whole, as all rivers flow into one another and ultimately into the sea. But just as this is only possible because the sea itself is taken up into the clouds and redistributed to the mountain sources from which the rivers flow, so we are only able to demonstrate of all the parts that they are the whole, because the whole itself, indemonstrably, is in its turn all these parts. End of quote. Barfield, moreover, derives this conception not only from Dionysius and Aquinas and Steiner and the tradition generally, but also from St. Augustine's Confessions, which he quotes and which he must have studied during this period. On the back of the first page of the manuscript of the Toto et Parte, he put a Latin epigraph taken from the fourth book of the Confessions, where St. Augustine refers to Plotinus's concept of the fall of the soul as this narrowing down of her consciousness to the part associated with her own body. The epigraph used by Barfield is quid per illam sentis in parte est. And the paragraph in the Confessions from which it is taken runs as follows, in Chadwick's translation. Why then are you perversely following the leading of your flesh? If you turn away from it, it has to follow you. All that you experience through it is only partial. You are ignorant of the whole to which the parts belong, yet they delight you. But if your physical perception were capable of comprehending the whole, and had not for your punishment been justly restrained to a part of the universe, you would wish everything at present in being to pass away, so that the totality of things could provide you with greater pleasure. The words we speak, it's interesting that Augustine refers to language here. The words we speak, you hear by the same physical perception, and you have no wish that the speaker stop at each syllable. You want him to hurry on so that other syllables may come and you may hear the whole. That is always how it is with the sum of the elements out of which a unity is constituted. And the elements out of which it is constituted never exist all at the same moment. There would be more delight in all the elements than in individual pieces, if only one had the capacity to perceive all of them. But far superior to these things is he who made all things, and he is our God. He does not pass away, nothing succeeds him. At the same time, or shortly after completing the Toto et Parte, Barfield wrote a short essay entitled Death. It was edited by Jane Hippolito. Lewis considered it the best piece he had ever read on the subject of death. In it, Barfield is extremely frank and passionate, combining philosophy and religion in a Platonic spirit. He mentions two open secrets that he has discovered, the discovery of which transforms human life. The first secret is the will to die is one with highest life. And the other secret is the nothingness of the self, provided it is willed, is not nothing, but something. Barfield considers the love of truth to be the core of philosophy and religion, which leads him to the discovery formulated as self equals zero. At the same time, Barfield, although he mentions Eastern mysticism, Plato, and the Gospel, emphasizes the importance of the relationship to God and love as the fullest realization of these two secrets. And quote from Barfield's essay, "For all your life long, you have been seeking another. The only otherness is the otherness of an alter ego, of another will and free, and in that freedom like to and separate from your own." End of quote. And again, Barfield refers in this essay to St. Augustine, quoting in Latin, this time from Book 2 of the Confessions, "Perversa te imitantur omnes." Augustine writes, "In their perverted way, all humanity imitates you." He addresses God, of course. "Yet they put themselves at a distance from you and exalt themselves against you. But even by thus imitating you, they acknowledge that you are the creator of all nature, and so concede that there is no place where one can entirely escape from you." End of quote. For the Bishop of Hippo, even sin, this closing up of the self in oneself and a perverse worship of one's individuality, is an unconscious homage that all fallen spirits pay to God, the only source of true individuality and at the same time true unity and community. Barfield goes on to write in the same spirit that we saw in Solovyov and that will later permeate Ratzinger's eschatological reflections. Quote, "Now then, for the first time, a man understands immortality and knows himself immortal. For now he knows what it is to live in another, truly to be another." He goes on to ask the question, what is meant by being another when it is predicated of something which at the same time remains itself? That experience which we call personality is also connected with relation to others. And Barfield continues, "I hold that it follows from the very nature of our consciousness, if we examine it strictly and honestly, not only that it is free to move towards immortality, but also that the only immortality which is possible for it is a co-inherence of selves, a simultaneity of separateness and union, a being at the same time apart and the whole, of which the love, friendship, and the esprit de corps that we know in the flesh are only faint and feeble shadows." End of quote. Barfield uses the word co-inherence here in 1930. Around the same time, quite independently of Barfield, this concept becomes one of the key themes in the theology and literary works of Charles Williams, who was to meet Lewis and Barfield only a few years later when he moved to Oxford in 1939. It is on this foundation that Williams builds his spiritual ideal of substituted love, a practice in which we use our imagination to put ourselves in another person's situation and we take into ourselves his suffering. The practice is described in his penultimate novel, Descent into Hell, published in 1937. For Williams, the biblical basis for the idea of substitution was the words of St. Paul, "Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ," Galatians 6:2. Philosophically, on the other hand, Charles Williams derived it from the principle of co-inherence, which he derived from the ancient view of man as imago Trinitatis. And Williams writes in the figure of Beatrice, "That manner is said to be by the co-inherence of the divine persons in each other. And it has been held that the unity of mankind consists in an analogical co-inherence of men with each other." End of quote. Today we live in a time where we not only put the individual on a pedestal as an autonomous entity whose rights protect supposedly aggressive meddling from other such autonomous entities. We also, following Friedrich Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, and the postmodernists, put on a pedestal the individual who creates himself, bestows all rights on himself, decides for himself what and who he is. In his 1992 so-called Notorious Mystery passage, the US Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote, quote, "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life." End of quote. Much earlier, the Platonist philosopher and writer Iris Murdoch saw that this was exactly the vision of a man who, as she writes in The Sovereignty of the Good, Murdoch writes that he is the ideal citizen of the liberal state, a warning held up to tyrants. He has the virtue which the age requires and admires, courage. It is not such a very long step from Kant to Nietzsche, and from Nietzsche to existentialism and the Anglo-Saxon ethical doctrines, which in some ways closely resemble it. In fact, Kant's man had already received a glorious incarnation nearly a century earlier in the work of Milton. His proper name is Lucifer. End of quote. Lucifer, in the book of Revelation, calls the devil and Satan is individuality realized to the extreme, the archetype of complete rejection of co-inherence and a complete self-limitation to what he is, to the exclusion of everything else. Paradoxically, one could say that the devil has become an inanimate thing if we follow what Solovyov says about the impenetrability of corporeal being. If being a person means being others, being the universe, and being God, as Plotinus, Solovyov, Barfield, and Ratzinger all agree, Satan is not a person, because he is impenetrable. David C. Schindler mentions the tradition of Satan as having no face, because he isn't fully a person. He doesn't have the participative prosopon, face, of which Plotinus writes. Lewis points out that the fallen angels operate on a perverted kind of participation, which is devouring and destroying the individuality of others, sucking them into the self, as described in the Screwtape Letters or That Hideous Strength. But in his 1943 novel Perelandra, the enemy is called the Unman by Lewis. God became a man, and his enemy has become unman, we could say. If God became man so that man could become God, the enemy of our salvation has become a thing in order to unman man and turn him into a thing. Tolkien's poetic imaginative intuitions run so deep, although he doesn't express them in conceptual ways like Barfield or Lewis. In The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien writes about Sauron forging the Ring of Power and pouring a part of himself into this object. That's why the ring is a terrifying object that has, as it were, a will of its own, able to slip from the finger of its bearer, or even to master its bearer's will, as when Frodo, in spite of himself, on multiple occasions, moves his hand to put it on his finger, and when Gollum falls into a false selfhood of my precious. The ring is a horrifying pseudo-person because its creator is a pseudo-thing. Tolkien, as in any symbol, condenses here much more that can be unpacked through concepts and discursive thought. One of the aspects of his vision is a prophetic pointing to the spiritual dangers of the cult of the machine, today flourishing in the form of the worship of the so-called artificial intelligence, which may be artificial, but is certainly not intelligence. Artificial simulacra of intimacy, perverse terms like connectivity or FaceTime, Plotinus prosopon, provided by the internet and technology are not the true coherence that Barfield and Williams write about, but often become its diabolical reversals and perversions, isolation and loneliness in front of a screen, or the depersonalized social media mobs. Similarly, this applies to the closely related movement of so-called transhumanism. In a recent interview with Jordan Peterson, Elon Musk said that his friend and the Google co-founder, Sergey Brin, shared with him his conviction that he, Brin, would one day be able to upload his consciousness to a computer network and so live forever. Tolkien describes this much more bluntly, of course, when he depicts the ring wraiths who, coveting immortality, have become unmanned or artificial intelligences in the service of the Dark Lord by uploading their consciousness to the rings of power. Through the power of the rings, the enemy can see their thoughts, they can communicate, connectivity with each other and their Lord, but it's based on tyranny, fear, and hatred, not on love. The relationship between the enemy and the ring is in Tolkien's work precisely a diabolical, perverse imitation of coherence, perversita imitantur, as Barfield quotes Augustine. A part of Sauron's spirit exists in the ring, and thus can penetrate also those who use the ring or submit to it. Therefore, the enemy becomes something like a machine. He is a thing, really, not a person. Although he still remains ontologically and residually a person because he was created as a spiritual being, and a spiritual being is an archetype of personality. And only yesterday, on the way here, I talked with Szymon Majewski, who is going to present in the afternoon, my student. In the conversation with him, I realized that the figure of Lord Vader in Star Wars is also an attempt to show how the transformation from a person into the machine is the same dynamics of this Luciferian fall. The enemy was called Lucifer, the morning star, but his entire existence denies this name. For the morning star is the sign, the symbol, the icon pointing to the rising sun, which already for Plato was the allegory of the good. And in Christian Platonism, the sun is also the allegory of the God-man, who is the son of justice, Malachi 4:2, and the rising sun, Luke 1:78. However, Lucifer, the light bearer, the one who was created to reflect the light and point to it, turned away from the light. Solovyov says that to be a person is to be in the truth, that is, to be in others, in everything, in God. As we remember, the Lord says that Satan, quote, abode not in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaketh a lie, he speaketh of his own, for he is a liar and the father of it. John 8:44. Thus, he continues to bear the name he has perverted when he became, quote, the great dragon, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. Book of Revelation 12. Dante depicts Lucifer at the center of the earth, deadly cold. The earth is the symbol of the corporeal and the impenetrable in the Divine Comedy, in contrast to the higher heavens, the angels, and God himself. As Barfield notes in his early essay on the Divine Comedy, although the earth is the center for us, for the angels, it is the outermost surface of the universe. So if Lucifer is at the center of the earth, it means that for himself, he is the center of everything. But his impenetrable self-limitation reduces him to pure surface and to negligible outer rim of the real. His frozen nature, in contrast to the fiery and luminous transparency of heavens, also points to the difference between the individual and the person as two modes in which a part can exist in the whole. Let's notice the significance of the fact that the church tradition has associated the morning star, Lucifer, literally that's the Latin name for the morning star, also with another figure, Mary, the Theotokos, the Mother of God. Let's remember that, as Hugo Rahner showed in his 1961 book, Our Lady and the Church, for the ancient church fathers, the Virgin Mary symbolized the entire church, and by extension, the unity of mankind and of the entire universe. Both the Eastern Orthodox and the Western Catholic iconography presents the Blessed Virgin as the paradigmatic icon or theophanic symbol, that is, as someone whose entire existence is pointing to the incarnated Logos. She is the human space for the Logos, sedes sapientiae, the seat of wisdom, or in the Eastern tradition, the Hodegetria, the one who shows the way, or the Panagia, the all-holy. Also in the Eastern Orthodox iconographic motif of deesis, that is the Virgin and Saint John the Baptist standing on both sides of Christ, we can see another, this time male figure, whose entire existence is also exhausted in symbolic, iconic, and theophanic bearing witness of the light, as the prologue to John says about John the Baptist. John the Baptist points to the Lord and says, "This is the Lamb of God," John 1:29. And he says, "He must increase, but I must decrease," John 3:30. That is why the Mother of God and the Forerunner are the archetypes of what it is to be human. It is not to be merely ourselves, but to become icons or symbols, that is, beings who are about something else, who are directing attention away from the part to the whole, who are theophanies. That is why Mary is called in the East the true Lucifer, Phosphoros, the light bearer, And in the West, she is called Stella Maris, star of the sea, that is Venus, the Virgin Mother of Love. The Proto-Evangelium in Genesis 3:15 refers to the true and new Eve as the one who will crush the head of the serpent. Tolkien, therefore, chose for the day of the destruction of the Ring of Power and for the ultimate fall of Sauron. By the way, Saura in Greek means lizard. None other date than the 25th of March, which is the feast of the Annunciation, commemorating the day on which the God-man was conceived in the immaculate womb of the Mother of God. The contrast between the dragon, who is impenetrably himself, and the Blessed Virgin, who is pure openness and thus always infinitely more than herself, is beautifully depicted in the 12th chapter of the book of Revelation. The red dragon stands before the woman clothed with the sun, who has been traditionally identified with the church and with the Mother of God, in order to devour her son. This opposition is translated further into the war in heaven between the holy angels led by Saint Michael and the fallen angels led by the dragon. But the triumph of what the woman represents over what the dragon stands for is made possible, as the book of Revelation says, by the blood of the Lamb, which symbolizes the total giving of the self. Ratzinger writes that St. John in his Gospel concludes, quote, his portrait of the earthly Jesus with the image of an existence whose walls are torn down, which knows no more firm boundaries, but is essentially openness. And Ratzinger quotes from the Gospel, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water, end of quote. It's 1934. For John, continues Ratzinger, the picture of the pierced side forms the climax not only of the crucifixion scene, but of the whole story of Jesus. Now, after the piercing with a spear that ends his earthly life, his existence is completely open. Now he is entirely for, end of quote. The book of Revelation says that those who defeat the dragon are those who, quote, loved not their lives unto the death, end of quote. But the struggle between these two ways in which the individual can exist, in total openness or in deadly self-limitation, continues as, quote, the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ, end of quote, Revelation 12:17. Charles Williams writes, quote, it is with the image of the co-inherent Godhead, which is in mankind, that we have to deal. The chief reason for mentioning that co-inherence here is that it is an idea similar to that carried by the Beatrician and Marian title, Filia del tuo figlio, the daughter of her son, of your son. Williams here cites the famous prayer to the Blessed Virgin put by Dante in the mouth of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux at the beginning of the last canto of the Divine Comedy. For Williams, the paradox of Mary's relationship with the incarnate Logos is a picture of true co-inherence, which is the beginning, principle, and purpose of humanity's existence as imago Trinitatis. Williams also cites Dante's words from his prose treatise on monarchy. Sed genus humanum maxime Deo assimilatur, quando maxime est unum, vera enim ratio unius in solo illo est. But humankind is most like God when it is most one, for the true principle of unity is in him alone. And to conclude, Williams continues his meditation on the title Filia del tuo figlio, saying, being theirs, Mary's and Beatrice's, it is also mankind's. It is the intended principle of our being. It is the function for which we were created, not it for us. The incarnation, or rather the motherhood of the incarnation, is the function for which we were created, and not it for us, end of quote. The return of all creation to the Father, to the ultimate fullness and whole, is accomplished in this motherhood of the incarnation, which is the unity of the universe and mankind, in which every person is every other person, and the whole, and of which the Church is the sacrament, and Virgin Mary the brightest human example. It is the return of the image to its archetype, The return from what Barfield describes as faint and feeble shadows of friendship and love that we know in the flesh. The return to the amor che muove il sol e l'altre stelle, from the closing words of the comedy. It is the return of all reality from shadows and images to the truth, ex umbris et imaginibus in veritatem, as the inscription on the grave of St. John Henry Newman proclaims. Thank you.